Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lutheran Reflections. My name is William Green, and for the first time in 213 episodes, I am not joined by Pastor Brian King. He is not able to make it this evening or next week, if I recall correctly. And so we have someone else joining us tonight. I have with me Brandon, also known as It's Mr. B123 on Twitch. He's a prolific Christian Twitch streamer and a great friend to Lutheran Reflections. We owe a lot of our success as far as live viewership is concerned to Brandon and the work he's done in the Christian community on Twitch. That's one of the first things that really got us into doing this live on Twitch anyway. And so we're very happy to have Brandon here with us tonight.
I'm blessed to join you. This is an amazing honor. Oh my goodness.
You've been watching and like commenting on Lutheran Reflections for a while, and you're at least a discerning Lutheran, or you're discerning Lutheran.
Whoa, whoa.
So that's good
Yeah.
enough for us.
Okay.
But
What's up?
thanks for being here tonight. This is a special
Of course.
episode. When Pastor King told us that he couldn't be on tonight, we wanted to take a little bit of a break from the series we have been doing. As you know, if you've been listening to the podcast or watching the live streams lately, we've spent the last several months doing a series based on Edward Kaler's Summary of Christian Doctrine. We've just been going through that text, and that's still the plan. We'll continue that series after Pastor King comes back. But in his absence tonight, we wanted to do something a little bit different. Um, this topic, the use of musical instruments in worship, is a topic that came up through a conversation of one of our friends who is also a friend of the stream, Jeremiah, who's with us in chat as well. Um, this is basically a presentation I gave for one of my seminary classes. Several months ago, Jeremiah had mentioned to me that basically all the church fathers condemned the use of musical instruments in worship. And I had never researched this topic before. And so I wanted to, first of all, see if that was true. Not that I doubted that what he was saying was true, but I just wanted to see what the church fathers were saying for myself. And also, Jeremiah was presenting this as sort of a defeater against, or at least evidence against the way that Lutherans have basically always worshipped since the time of the Reformation. Luther was one of the few reformers who very happily adopted musical instruments into worship life. Both Calvin and Zwingli rejected the use of instruments straight off the bat, but Luther incorporated them right away. And so, for like us Lutherans who, claim to have continuity with the historic church, generally speaking, this is kind of like a weird point of tension for us because if it is indeed the case, and it is, that the church fathers nearly unanimously reject the use of musical instruments, is it that are we back? Did I disconnect?
Looks like I think we're good now.
Okay, great. How is it that Lutherans can, use instruments in worship and claim to be part of this continuation of it historic church? And so that's the question we want to answer tonight. And so yeah, this will be something new. I have the if you're watching live, I have the PowerPoint up on the screen here, and if you're on the podcast, it shouldn't make much of a difference. I'll still speak all these things out loud, obviously. Before we get into that, Brandon, anything you want to say by way of introduction? Tell us a bit about yourself, your background, maybe.
I'm just a dude. It's the best description of me.
Aren't we all?
Uh, um, Grew up, in a Christian household, and then as a Baptist, and through more discussions and talks, learning denominations and such, I have found that Lutheran theology is pretty robust, and I've been definitely leaning that way. And music is a really interesting topic because you have the evangelicals who are very pro, music, um, And of course, if we are going to follow God, we want to make sure we're doing the right things.
Mhm.
So this is going to be interesting for sure. Should we? Should we not? What's the move? I think.
Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
So, as I said, Jeremiah had made the claim that the church fathers were broadly against the use of musical instruments in worship. And that appears to be true. We will look at some of the primary sources on this. And so, as I mentioned, this creates some tensions for Lutherans. Um, is it the case that musical instruments were like a true novelty of the Reformation? Like, was it really Luther who introduced this for the first time? And if so, is he defying the broad consensus of the church up until the time of the Reformation? And if he is, um, do we as Lutherans have to reject all of the arguments that the church fathers put forward with respect to the prohibition of instruments in worship? And so there's the historical question of whether or not such a consensus exists prior to the Reformation. But then there's also more of like a philosophical, theological question of, okay, even if that was the consensus, is it the case that we as Lutherans have to reject all of these arguments of the church fathers to justify our worship practices? And so that's kind of going to be the question that guides our discussion tonight. Um, I have this quote here from scholar James McKinnon. I wanted to mention his perspective because um, he indeed agrees that there was a unanimous rejection of the use of musical instruments in the church, especially in the era of the church fathers. However, his claim is that this rejection didn't come from a specific antagonism towards instruments themselves, but rather is just a result of early Christians taking their worship practice largely from the Jewish synagogue and not the temple. And so his argument is that basically instruments had no use in the synagogue, even though they did in the temple. And because early Christian worship life evolved from the synagogue and not temple worship, just there was a natural absence of musical instruments in
Hmm.
the worship life of the early church. This is an interesting perspective. Like, certainly there is some continuity between the synagogal worship practices of the Old Testament and the New Testament church. At the same time, when he says that there was no like inherent antagonism toward instruments, I don't know. I was reading like Cyril, and there definitely seems to be some antagonism toward instruments, just generally speaking. And that was part of the culture as well. Like even before the New Testament era, you have like Aristotle saying that flutes and flautists in particular just naturally disposed people to debauchery and moral degradation. And so that's, yeah, I know
That's a
it's like a
take.
crazy claim for Rusty here, but you had these sentiments floating around in the ancient world that there was something intrinsically immoral about instruments, or something at least that led people into a state of like sensual sin or away from the contemplative life, certainly. And so,
Hmm.
anyway, I bring up McKinnon's perspective because certainly, like the continuity between New Testament worship and the synagogue probably does play some role, but also I think there was some inherent antagonism toward musical instruments, just culturally speaking, that
All right.
probably played a role here. Um, we have this other guy here. This is from the Encyclopedia of Ancient Christianity. He mentions a few interesting concessions about uh, times when musical instruments were used in worship, or at least certain church fathers permitted their use. His claim is that Chrysostom allowed for the reed pipe, which is like a bagpipe type instrument, and certain other instruments to be used in the liturgy, perhaps. However, prohibited the use of ear-splitting instruments, as he calls them. And we'll look at some direct quotes from Chrysostom to see why he had this view. But there is broad scholarly consensus that more or less the church fathers were basically unanimously against the use of most instruments in worship. But I just wanted to put that here as a interesting caveat to that. So now let's dig into some of the primary sources themselves. We have Clement of Alexandria here. That should say Alexandria on the slide. He says, the one instrument of peace, the word alone by which we honor God, is what we, meaning the church, should employ. We no longer employ the ancient psaltery, which is a stringed instrument, and trumpet and timbrel and flute, which those expert in war and contemners of the fear of God were wont to make use of also in the choruses at their festive assemblies, that by such strains they may raise their dejected minds. So we have this like first argument here that certain musical instruments are intimately tied to pagan practices. And so he was saying like that there's these pagans who make use of musical instruments at their festive assemblies.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these instruments appeared to be intimately tied to those pagan practices. And so there appeared to be some concern in the early church that by employing the use of those same instruments, you might bring something of pagan culture into the church. And they didn't want to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Understandably so. Like if you have certain instruments, of course, that are associated only with like war or known to make people like riled up,
mm-hmm.
You don't want to bring that into a house of worship. That's the argument.
True. Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, that's reasonable, I think.
Yeah.
Here we have John Chrysostom. He says, here there is no need for the cithara, or for stretched strings, or for the plectrum and technique. The plectrum is like a guitar pick, basically. Or for any musical instrument. But if you like, you may yourself become a cithara by mortifying the members of the flesh and making a full harmony of mind and body. So here we have another approach. Just saying, like we don't need these instruments. We glorify God in other ways, and he almost sees these things as like kind of allegorically here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we have other ways of worshiping God that doesn't make use of these more carnal means. Here we have Cyprian, who says he, referring to the musician, endeavors to speak with his fingers, ungrateful to the artificer who gave him a tongue. These things, being instruments, even if they were not dedicated to idols, ought not to be approached and gazed upon by faithful Christians, because even if they were not criminal, they are characterized by a worthlessness which is extreme and which is little suited to believers. This is the kind of antagonism toward instruments I referred to earlier.
Okay.
Like so Cyprian here, not only is he obviously forbidding the use of instruments in worship, but he sees them as like so totally useless that Christians should have nothing to do with musical instruments altogether. So these are the ways that the church fathers are speaking about instruments. Yeah.
Right. So that wasn't even in context to like corporate worship. That's saying in general.
Yes.
Okay.
Now he references something about even if they were not criminal here.
Right.
Like, I mean, that seems to imply that they were like outlawed, like at least some instruments at some time. I don't know if he's talking about in the context of the church. I don't know the history there, but that's just an interesting aside, I guess.
Yeah, I wish I was able just to time travel into this culture and be asking around, hey, what's all the music at? What's going on? How do we feel about this stuff? And because that's a very interesting take, not gonna lie.
Yeah, I mean, this gets you a feel for how the church fathers were thinking about instruments, and presumably how the broader culture was thinking about instruments as well. And so, yeah, this is characteristic of what the church fathers teach.
Hmm.
Now, this is interesting for a number of reasons, but the church fathers recognized that there was a tension here
Right.
because the Old Testament talks about musical instruments in the context of worship all the time.
Hmm.
Like the Psalms are full of references to instruments, um, basically in worship settings. Like the Psalms are all prayers, right? It's referencing all of these instruments, saying to praise God with all of these different things. And then you have other allusions to instruments being used in worship in the Old Testament also.
Hmm.
And so they were very aware that this strict prohibition against musical instruments seems to be contrary to what the Old Testament was teaching.
Right.
And so they had essentially two different strategies for dealing with this. Some church fathers were prone to allegorizing these passages, and others were prone to confining instruments specifically to Old Testament use. And so you see both approaches in different people, but you don't really see them combined. So we'll look at a few examples of
Okay.
this. So this is Clement of Alexandria, and he is probably the best example of the allegorizing approach. So he says, this is him commenting on the Psalms. He says, and praise him on the lyre. By the lyre is meant the mouth struck by the Spirit, as it were by a plectrum, again, like a guitar pick. Praise with the timbrel and the dance refers to the church meditating on the resurrection of the dead in the resounding skin. For man is truly a pacific instrument, while other instruments, if you investigate, you will find to be warlike, inflaming to lusts, or kindling up armors, or rousing wrath. So, yeah, you see, he is allegorizing all these instruments. So when he says his take on the Psalms is that when it says praise him on the lyre, it doesn't mean that literally. The lyre is an allegory for the mouth struck by the Spirit, and the timbrel and the dance refers to the church meditating on the resurrection of the dead. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like you see this sort of allegorizing with a lot of the Christians in Alexandria, and sometimes I think the allegorizing goes a little bit off the rails. Like
Hmm.
I don't know. Like, do you think this is like a reasonable interpretation of this text?
If I'm being honest, it feels like when I'm in a discussion with somebody and a text says something and they're just trying to shove an interpretation into it. I think that's like what hermeneutics.
Hmm.
And I feel like if I had read those sections, I would not have gotten to this is the church meditating on the resurrection of the dead. Like I would not have jumped to that conclusion.
Hmm.
Um, and I would feel as if it had to be something else.
Hmm.
So they had to come up with something. I'm sure there was more, how they got to that. I don't want to straw man it, but at the same time, that's the initial, knee jerk reaction. I feel.
Yeah. Jeremiah in chat is saying that the confinement to the Old Testament was agreed with the allegorization, and they taught both at the same time. Okay, I make the distinction, Jeremiah, because like it seems like John Chrysostom, who we'll get to in a little bit, like denies the allegorization approach. At least you don't see an example of allegorizing the instruments in his writings. And so I make the distinction, not that they're necessarily mutually exclusive, but because it does seem like that's the primary approach taken by Clement, and you don't see as much as the Old Testament language in Clement. You only see the allegorizing more or less, and with Chrysostom, it's the opposite. He never allegorizes,
Hmm.
but he does talk about Old Covenant use. And so I know the two like can be held together, as we'll see later on with Aquinas. But you do have, I think, two somewhat separate schools of thought, at least in the church fathers, from the evidence that I've seen. And that's a good segue to Chrysostom. So here is what he says about this. Instruments were permitted to them, referring to the ancient Israelites, out of regard for the weakness of their spirit, and because they had hardly emerged as yet from the cult of idols. Just as God allowed their sacrifices, so also he allowed their instruments, condescending to their weakness. So Chrysostom's argument here is that the Israelites were particularly prone to pagan practices. And so he seems to indicate that the mandating of like the sacrificial system
Mm-hmm.
was like a condescension to their proclivity to sacrifice to idols, which is interesting that he makes that connection with musical instruments. And so he's saying, look, these Israelites are so prone to pagan practices, and these musical instruments are part of that pagan world. And so God, condescending to their weakness, allowed them to have musical instruments in their worship as a way of accommodating these, or in some way, like Christianizing these
Mm-hmm.
pagan practices. So those are the two kinds of arguments you see in the fathers. And like Jeremiah said, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but they are two distinct approaches to this question. Now, I won't spend much time on the medieval acceptance of these positions, just to say that it appears that the arguments that the church fathers made were more or less broadly accepted by medieval theologians. So you see this particularly in Thomas Aquinas, who employs both kinds of argumentation in his treatment on this subject. So we have here a quote from the Summa. He says, on the Old Testament, instruments of this description were employed both because the people were more coarse and carnal, so that they needed to be aroused by such instruments, as also by earthly promises, and because these material instruments were figures of something else. So again, you see Chrysostom's argument that the Israelites were just, as to use Aquinas' words, a coarse and carnal people, and they needed instruments in their worship life to, get them going.
Mm-hmm.
And also, he accepts the idea that when the Old Testament talks about these instruments, it is speaking in figures, to use Aquinas' words. So anyway, all this to say, the opinion of the Church Fathers carried well into the medieval era, and from what we can tell, pretty much up to the time of the Reformation. So again, Aquinas says, but the church does not make use of musical instruments such as harps and psalteries in the divine praises for fear of seeming to imitate the Jews. So this was another thing.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be this fear that by using musical instruments in worship, that there would be some sort of like Judaizing concern there, that people would think we're trying to imitate Jewish worship by incorporating these things into
Right.
Christian worship. And that was certainly a concern of the time, as it is now to some extent.
Yeah.
So, all right, so we'll just summarize the historical arguments, then we'll get into the evaluation here.
Okay.
So the arguments are, roughly speaking, that some musical instruments are intimately tied to secular practices and don't belong in the church. That's argument one. Argument two, instruments arouse pleasure and distract from true worship. So that's what we found in, was it Cyprian, who had said something to that effect. And then finally, three, Old Testament uses of instrumental worship were concessions for carnally minded believers, and to revive such a practice would be to return to the Old Covenant. Now, so these are the kinds of arguments you see in Aquinas and in the Church Fathers. I point this out because the people who are arguing against the use of instruments in worship today are typically not using these arguments. Like the ones who are now against musical instruments are mostly the Reformed,
Hmm.
and they argue from the regulative principle of worship, right? Not that they would reject the arguments that the church fathers are making here, but that is not usually the primary line of argumentation that you'll see with the Reformed. It's more stemmed to and tied to the regulative principle of worship. This
Okay.
idea that you're not allowed to do anything in worship unless the Bible specifically commands it, right?
Right.
And so they'll say the New Testament doesn't command that we use instruments in worship, and so these things are not permitted. This is not the same kind of arguments the Church Fathers or Aquinas were using. And so, yeah, like I said, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there is a historical difference in how people are arguing this from now compared with the patristic era and the medieval era. Um, I won't say much on this, but Luther, and I alluded to this at the beginning, Luther was definitely the person who had the most influence on introducing musical instruments into the church. You did have a few isolated instances of pipe organs being used in Roman Catholic churches before the Reformation. There's one reference to an organ as early as the 7th century.
Hmm.
And then you have a few other specific mentions of pipe organs being installed in churches, um, especially after the 10th century. And so it's not like this was a totally novel practice. But what you don't have is like a theology of musical instruments being introduced until after
Sure.
the Reformation. You just have these like random instances of pipe organs showing up in churches without any sort of theological discussion on the topic.
Hmm.
And so by the time of the Reformation, this was becoming more commonplace. But certainly after the Reformation, it became more so the norm. And Luther and his affinity for music and his theology of music was certainly the main contributing factor to that change from no musical instruments to musical instruments. So, all that being said, let's evaluate the patristic arguments. So, we have the three that I mentioned earlier. Argument one, some musical instruments are ultimately tied to secular practices, don't belong in the church. Argument two, instruments arouse pleasure and distract from true worship. And so let's deal with these two first. Interestingly enough, a lot of Lutherans have affirmed basically both of these arguments in their prohibitions against or discussions against contemporary worship music. So, like, let's look at argument one. Some musical instruments are intimately tied to secular practices and don't belong in the church. I have heard that specific argument from so many Lutherans with respect to, like, I'll say, like, rock band style worship.
Sure. Right. Right. Right.
They're like, when you bring that style of worship in the church, there are all sorts of cultural associations that come along with that. And you necessarily import that into the church when you bring that musical style into worship.
Yeah.
You've heard something similar, I imagine.
I could get that conclusion for sure. If it because I mean that's the big argument against the the worshiptainment style of
Mm-hmm.
churches where it's looking more like a band. It's more looking like a concert than it is of a type of reverend sermon or anything like that.
Yeah.
Even though the instruments aren't inherently sinful, in that argument, they're saying, hey, this looks a little bit too much like something else. Maybe it's not a good idea
Mm-hmm.
to try to look like that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And that's pretty much what the church fathers were saying with the instruments of their day. Like, hey, these things are tied to what the pagans are doing. And so we don't want to bring all those pagan connotations into our worship
Hmm.
services, right? And so like honestly, I think Lutherans generally accept that line of reasoning. And so, yeah, we'll leave it there for now. Argument two: instruments arouse pleasure and distract from true worship. So this is what Cyprian was getting at. That you have certain instruments that are like warlike in nature, and they just by nature get people riled up, right? And I've heard that same argument used for certain styles of worship in the Lutheran Church. Like there are just some kinds of music that they do incite the passions, and they're not conducive to like contemplation, right?
Let me ask, when you say when I've heard this in the Lutheran Church, are you referring to like the like with organs and such, or are you referring to other people who are Lutherans criticizing other denominations?
I'm referring to like contemporary worship in particular.
Okay.
Like, yeah, not like the use of organs, but
Okay, because I'm like, oh, like what's it? Like I'm thinking of a hymn that really gets me riled up for war. I'm like, I don't
yeah,
know if there is one.
I'm thinking like some Lutherans will talk this way about a drum kit,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Or like electric guitar.
yeah.
Like there's something about the drums that it does. It's like it's more conducive to energizing you and like getting you excited rather than contemplation. And so yeah, there's something to be said about that.
I was just gonna say real
Yeah.
quick on that point. I've heard that very much as well, where because it's becoming like a concert, you are going there for almost like entertainment and to feel good
Hmm.
rather than devout worship. And it's a hard case to make, to be honest, because it's so based on the individual.
Hmm. Did I disconnect or did Brandon? Chad, am I still here? Is it just me or is it just is it Brandon? Oh, Brandon did. Okay, you guys can still hear me. Okay. Hopefully he comes back shortly. Okay, good. I'm still here. All right. Hopefully we get him back soon. But yeah. Okay, he's reloading in now. Nice. Nice. Ah, here he is. Very good. Welcome back, Brandon.
Okay.
God, Nate.
Hello. Sorry about that. The Lord said, you've been talking too much. Just let him continue with his points.
That's hilarious. Okay. But yeah, you were saying that
Okay, I'll try then. If that happens again, we'll just skip that point. I've heard the same things where because it's too much like a concert, you are worshiping. It's become more of a entertainment and
mhm,
not worship. It's a feel good. I think the problem is sometimes it can be really hard to discern because it's so based on individual. Where it's like, oh, you do feel this way. It's hard to tell people what they feel. But I can say for myself that I think like I could definitely make that argument for myself, where it's just like I'm rocking out more than I am really having my mind focused on the service itself
mhm,
for the
yeah,
more contemporary music, of course, that I'm referring
yeah,
to.
exactly. And so, I mean, I think that Lutherans and probably many other Protestants actually accept these first two lines of argumentation as being totally valid. We don't want to import pagan cultural connotations into our own worship. And we recognize that at least some instruments do inordinately get people riled up in ways that aren't helpful to true worship. So we can totally agree with the church fathers on both of those 2 points. Now that brings us to we'll skip that to the third point, that Old Testament uses of instrumental worship were concessions for carnally minded believers, and to revive such a practice would be to return to the Old Covenant. There are two interesting implications of this argument that are just assumed. The first is that the appropriate use of specific instruments is at least in part determined by the dispositions of believers in a particular cultural context. And so, what I mean by that is, um, it was apparently beneficial for the Israelites to have musical instruments in their worship life. I mean, that's basically what Aquinas was saying, right? That they were a particularly, quote, coarse and carnal people, and because of that, these musical instruments motivated them to worship in a way that they wouldn't have been able to worship without them.
Hmm.
Now, even though Aquinas paints that as a bad thing, um, that is the implication here: is that these instruments were good for the Israelites because of something about their culture or stubbornness or something about their disposition. They benefited from the use of instruments in their worship, even though it wasn't ideal.
Hmm.
Um, so, like, what do we make of that? Does that make the use of instruments in worship in some ways culturally dependent? So, if we're saying that God made this concession of musical instruments in worship to the Israelites because of their coarse and carnal nature or culture or whatever it might be, like, might it be the case that we are more akin to the ancient Israelites than like the early church? Like, I know people who hate traditional Christian worship, right? At liturgy, all these things. They want to go to a church that has like a band, right? They want to worship using music that sounds like music that they listen to.
Hmm.
And they will refuse to go to any church except for a church that has like contemporary Christian worship music. Um, yes, Jeremiah. And so, yeah, like, is it the case that those people might in some way benefit from that style of worship?
Right.
I don't know. I'm inclined to say that there are people who probably benefit from it, even though it's not the ideal, um, or even like generally good. You know what I
Right.
mean? Different people are at different places, and like, it's better for you to go to a church that has contemporary worship and a rock band or whatever style of music than no church at all. And if and it shouldn't be this way. I'm not trying to like excuse this mindset, but
Hmm.
if that is the mindset of certain people, that I'm going to go to a church with a rock band or I'm not going to go to a church at all, certainly it's better for them to go to a church with a rock band than not at all, right?
It makes me wonder about. I think it might have been Romans 14 and really the whole book of Galatians about you know, the food that was offered up the pagans, and some people who converted out of that didn't want to go to the market and eat the potentially, you know, idol meat. So they were like, okay,
Yeah,
you guys can't
yeah.
eat it at all. It's like, well, that's not, we don't want to make a stumbling block. And that's kind of where my mind kind of goes in the situation. So it's like, well, if they're getting into the church, I feel that's going to be a better case, of course, than sitting at home and maybe doing something, you know, not getting them closer to God. And of course, I would assume that they would might, grow and continue to learn and say, um, hey, maybe I need to find a more traditional church or something of that sort. Um, so I would probably be in agreement with that point.
Hmm. Yeah,
It's really interesting. Wow.
yeah. So if the appropriate use of musical instruments is, at least in part, culturally dependent on the people and their disposition, we have to ask whether or not we're living in a culture where the use of musical instruments, even ones like the ones we've been talking about, like kind of the rock band style,
Right.
whether or not even those things might aid people who have this particular cultural mindset, that they're so entrenched in that specific view that that's what they like, that they almost like are dependent on that for their worship experience,
Mm.
even if that's not the ideal. Might that be the case? And I think that's like a reasonable question to ask, if nothing else. So, what do we take from this? Lutherans, and I mean Christians in general, can agree with the church fathers that some instruments are not suitable for use in worship. And this includes instruments that are intimately tied to secular practices and those that distract from the purpose of the service. And there might be some, like the Old Testament believers, that may be helped by worship practices that are otherwise not ideal. And that really is the argument of the church fathers and Aquinas, right? The use of musical instruments is not ideal, but God condescended to the weakness of the Israelites, and so he permitted it for them, right? So yeah, we can agree with all those things in principle. Whoops. Okay, here we are. So if we accept the church fathers' premises as reasonable, how can we justify the use of instruments in our worship? And there is one thing here that I think is historically relevant, and that is the invention of the pipe organ. Because for the first time, and the origins of the organ go back, far before the Reformation or even the 6th century. But you see 6th, 7th century, at least one instance of an organ being installed in a church. For the first time, you have an instrument that avoids most of the pitfalls of the church fathers that we've looked at so far. So the pipe organ was not in any way tied to pagan practices. It actually became popular in the setting of the church. So all of these arguments that these instruments are tied to pagan or non-Christian practices, and for those reasons we can't import these cultural connotations into our worship service. You don't have that problem with the pipe organ. In fact, not only do you not have that problem, the pipe organ, because of its history, has like a specific religious connotation.
Mm-hmm.
Like you see that, right? Like in a movie or a cartoon, when they want to evoke some sort of religious atmosphere, they'll start playing pipe organ music.
Right.
Because we culturally associate the organ with divine things. And so not only is the organ devoid of these pagan connotations, it actually carries with it like a divine connotation or a Christian connotation even that every other instrument in the world lacks. And so if we're going to say that the cultural connotations tied to instruments matter, then that should be a factor in this conversation. We have an instrument with a specifically Christian connotation, and you don't have that really prior to the invention of the pipe organ. The pipe organ also uniquely mirrors the human voice and supports congregational participation in the service in a way that no other instrument does. We saw in some of the church fathers a preference for the human voice as the sole instrument of worship. And if you think about the instruments that were around during their time, none of them were as closely aligned with the human voice as the pipe organ. Like even the mechanism of making the noise in the organ is more similar to a voice than any of the instruments than they would have imagined.
I never knew that.
Yeah. And so you don't have some of these other problems that the church fathers had brought up against the instruments of their day with the pipe organ. Those things just simply aren't there. Not only is the organ not a distraction to the goal of worship, it actually actively supports congregational singing and participation. And also, finally, the organ can in no way be seen as a return to the Old Covenant because the organ had no place in the Old Covenant, right?
Yeah.
So Aquinas seemed to be particularly interested in avoiding the specific instruments mentioned in the Old Testament because, quote, for fearing to imitate the Jews, right?
Right.
You obviously
Right.
don't have that concern with the organ because the Jews didn't have a pipe organ, right? So I do think the invention and use of pipe organs in Christian worship was like a unique turning point in history as far as this discussion is concerned. Even if we accept all of the theological arguments of the church fathers, um, the organ itself circumvents a lot of these concerns that they had, right? And so, yeah, I think we can accept, at least in some sense, just about all of the theological premises of the church fathers and their arguments against instruments in worship, but come to a different practical conclusion, just given our historical setting and what we now have in the pipe organ as an instrument of worship. That's my spiel.
It was very well done, and for the listeners, the presentation itself was very, what's the word? Full of aesthetic. I don't know what the word is for that, but
There are a lot of
it
nice
was good.
pictures
Yeah.
here, yeah. Some pictures of pipe organs and stuff like that.
Mm.
So I'm curious to hear what Jeremiah thinks, since this entire project came out of a conversation I had with him. Jeremiah, you want to come on and talk about it?
And I also have a question for this
Yeah.
thing. Um, when you studied the church fathers and their views on instruments, what was the understanding about singing with the human voice? Because that could be considered our own instrument is our voice.
Mm-hmm.
Was singing seen as an instrument? Was as seen as, that's fine because it's not a separate object that makes sounds.
Singing itself was always permitted in worship, like as far
Okay.
as we can tell. Like there was never a time when singing itself was outlawed. There was one specific, I say that. There was one specific church council that limited who could sing in worship.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it was only like the deacon or something should be singing. Um, I don't remember the exact council, but you did have restrictions on who could sing in public worship.
Mm.
But music itself has basically been a component of Christian worship from the beginning. Of course, people have always been
Sure.
singing psalms and
I just wonder if there were any type of um, styles of singing that pagans would do that stirred people up, in which the church fathers would say, no, you can't sing in this way, as it's too close to what the pagans were singing. Like, I don't know if maybe I'm thinking like even like a Gregorian chant or something like that. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, oh, you guys can't do chants, but now we have chants. That's my thought process.
that's a good question. I don't know much about that. Like I don't know like the melodies or whatever that were being used to sing the psalms in the
Hmm.
early church, or if there was like a discussion or debate on what melodies should be used. That's a good question. Jeremiah said he can talk about melodies. He says there were restrictions, or there was a discussion, and he knows about
Bro
it.
knows.
All right, come on when you're ready, Jeremiah. Do you have the link?
Amazing job, by the way, for this.
This is fun. This was a good thing to do in Pastor King's absence. You don't have the link, Jeremiah? I'll send it to you again. Oh, there he is. He does have the link. Hey, Jeremiah. Welcome.
Jeremiah.
Surely I have toiled in vain to find the link. I thought that the link would like expire. I thought it was one link per thing. Like, you know
No,
what I mean? I
you
didn't know
have
it was reusable. I have like a perpetual
Yep.
media.
you now have perpetual access to
Yeah.
the Lutheran Reflections
Yeah, I
Restream
can just
Studio.
invade randomly. You don't gotta let me in though. So there's a lot of stuff to be said here. What topic do you want to start on?
I don't know. Just general thoughts on like what was said. Just general.
So I don't agree. No, well, I mean, I agree with the historical parts because those parts are just true.
Mhm.
I will say a few things. So about the allegorization, First of all, I have researched Chrysostom on this pretty extensively, and I was blocked on account of the fact that his Psalter commentary is not freely available. I've been trying to translate his Psalter commentary, and I've translated parts of it, but not any of the parts about instruments yet. So I'll tell you about that. But I will tell you that I've read a lot of patristics in their commentaries on the Psalms, and they're all quite agreed on this, that whenever they see an instrument mentioned in the Psalms, without any variance, they say that they do the allegorization thing, even if they also speak about them being Jewish in other places. So I was speaking about these things being agreed. Concerning the allegorization of the instruments, this was taken from, if I remember correctly, Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16. Which say to sing psalms, right? This is the Psalms, hymns, spiritual songs text. The texts are identical, so they're just parallel texts, right? They say the same thing. And the reason that they cited these texts was because the way that it words it is when it says to sing the psalms in your heart, the word that is used in Greek is literally to strum. So it's literally saying to strum these psalms in your heart, right? And so that's where they're getting this allegorization. Is from the New Testament. The reason that it seems bizarre to us is because we speak English and not Greek, and there's just not really a clear way to get this across in English, unless you want to literally because the word for sing, if you want to translate the word sing also as strum, but the problem is the word primarily means sing. It has the secondary meaning, like the etymology of strum, or like, right, and so, or like to literally harp, right, to literally harp these psalms. So that's just a translation thing, but that is where they're getting that, and they ubiquitously cite these passages. Concerning the organ's resemblance to the human voice, I don't think this is a good argument at all. And the reason that I don't think so is because the reason that they thought the human voice was far superior to all other instruments was particularly because it had the breath of life in it. They note what Paul says, and he's not talking about worship in this passage. It's in 1 Corinthians 14. He's talking about love. But it's he says that the instruments are lifeless, right? They don't have the breath of life in them. And they point to this, and they say that's the polemic that the Old Testament uses against idols, right? They have eyes that they don't see, ears they don't hear, mouths but don't speak, right? They don't have, they're carved to look alive, but they're dead, right? And they're saying this is the polemic that he's using as idols, and so the reason that the human voice is preferred is specifically because it has life. Now, an organ is in some ways actually more sinister than other instruments because it imitates the human voice, but it has no life in it, and it's dead, right? And so in that way, it's as sinister as the idol, because it's actually worse to have an idol that resembles life better than another idol does, but in fact is dead like the other. And so this is actually an argument against the organ, not an argument in favor of the organ. Concerning the regular principle of worship, it is true that this isn't as often appealed to by them, although it is sometimes, particularly by the medievals. Erasmus, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians in the same place, actually says, he complains that musical instruments, particularly the organ, right, because that was the history of it, was being introduced into the church, and that he thought it was like terrifying, and that he wanted it to stop. And he says that at the end that to add anything unto the worship of God is most wicked perversity. And so this is like an RPW argument he's making.
You don't have anything like the RPW and the patristic sources, right, that you found?
It's rare. They sometimes appeal to it in principle, but they're weird about it. Like they'll sometimes say like, yeah, you can't do this because it's not in the Bible. And you're like, cool. But then they'll recommend like something else that's like totally not in the Bible. And it's like, okay, well, like what are we doing? It's like, how the patristics are. Anyway. So that's just some general overview I would make concerning the carnality of instruments. So it is true that like the reason that God considered instruments in the Old Testament is that the people were stiff-necked, and it was a less spiritual people. But it's not merely that it was a less spiritual people; is that it was in a certain sense a less spiritual covenant. So, for example, in Psalm 50, and this isn't about musical instruments; this is about animal sacrifices, but the principle transfers. God basically is complaining that the people of Israel are offering animal sacrifices without sincerity, and he basically makes this polemic, and it's actually kind of sort of like funny in a way, right? It's kind of intended to be. He says, if I were actually, do you really think that I'm actually hungry for the blood of goats? Is that really what you think? Right? And he says, if I were really hungry for the blood of goats, if that's really what was going on here, and this wasn't just a concession, I could just, go eat them because I have the entire world and I can just go eat the goats if I'm hungry, right? And he says, if I were really hungry, I wouldn't tell you and I would just go deal with it myself, right? So that's kind of the polemic. Now, obviously, animal sacrifices don't continue. And the reason that animal sacrifices were used was because the surrounding nations were using animal sacrifices, but they never really took away since, right? And so I
just want to push back on that a second, because that's surely not the only reason they were used.
Well, that was part of it, right?
Well, I mean, okay, even if you can see
that's what Psalm 50 talks about it.
Right, but But there's like typological significance that was fulfilled in the
Right, just like with the instruments, as I spoke about in the exposition of Ephesians and Colossians.
what was the antitype for like the musical instruments?
What the patristics talk about in the strumming of the heart, and what Paul talks about in his letters, namely the strumming of the heart. No, I do agree that the patristics get a little over. So, like, concerning the allegorization of the musical instruments, I would simply say that the musical instruments signify and are prototypes of the spiritual movements in the soul of the Christian singing. But I would not get too specific about it, because sometimes you'll, like, if you read an Athanasius' commentary on the Psalms, he's like, yeah, the strings is like the number of nerves in the arm or whatever. And he gets a little weird about it, right? But principally, this is what's being prototyped. And it's sort of the same thing with animal sacrifice, although animal sacrifice is a more egregious version of it. Now, concerning the dependency on a carnal people, I would push back a little bit on that, although it's like true in a sense. The thing about the New Testament is that it's a more spiritual testament with more spiritual worship, like intrinsically, not just depending on the people. In Jesus' discourse in John 4 with the woman at the well, he explains to her that we worship, at the temple, and that there's going to be more spiritual worship, and that God is looking for worshipers who are going to worship him in spirit and in truth, which is the opposite of flesh, right? Because that's what's flesh is in the previous chapter, because what's flesh is flesh and what's spirit is spirit. And so the idea is the New Testament has spirit, like spiritual worship, whereas the Old Testament had like flesh worship, so to speak. And so all the ordinances of the Old Testament, well, not all of them, but the ones that aren't taught in the New Testament, right? The incense, the animal sacrifices, the blasting of the trumpet, the harp and the lyre, these are all distinctly carnal. And so they sort of vanish with the New Testament. And this is like what Paul talks about in Colossians 2:23, where he says that these ordinances have like vanished with the substance of Christ. And so it's not merely that God conceded this simply because they were carnal people, although they were, but he's actually instituted a more spiritual covenant even when you have, more carnal people, because of the spirituality of the new covenant, which far excels the old, these things are still required. Now, I will make one concession, and I don't agree with this, but it was the practice of the Dutch in the Synod in the National Synod of Dort in 1574, I think, that they ban instruments in the canons thereof. And then later in the Synod of Dort that everyone knows, the Arminian controversy Dort, they institute organs. And now they were against instruments. And in fact, Gisbertus Vocis, and I meant to quote him in chat, but I never got to it. Gisbertus Vocis says that organs are actually distracting and they don't help you sing. So they were against it. But in the Synod of Dort, they actually say to install organs. And the reason they did this is because people were converting lately out of popery, which was full of so many superstitions that they were afraid they wouldn't be able to handle it otherwise. But they phased it out after that, right? And so the goal was always, we're going to have these organs for a little bit, as in we're not going to remove, because they're already there, right? But we're not going to remove them for a bit. But it even says in the canons, explain to people why we shouldn't be doing this, and then try to phase it out naturally. And that's what they did. And people who make these sort of arguments about carnality never really seem to believe it for two reasons. First of all, they don't want to do this. They don't want to, deal gently with people and start to phase out the carnal superstitions. Even if you want, I don't agree that you should. I think you should just remove immediately and just deal with the wheat and chaff or whatever. But even if you want to do the easing, right? They don't ever want to do that. They don't ever advocate for that. Second of all, the people who are making these arguments are never the subject of the arguments, but they themselves still want the instruments. So, for example, Brandon, right? You were talking about how there are certain people who just won't go to church unless there's a band, right?
Yeah, I was talking about that.
They're unspiritual people.
Yeah.
So Brandon, as far as I understand, is in favor of using musical instruments and would have them to be used, even if not the guitar, maybe the organ or something, right? Like a piano, right? But I'm sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, that you, Brandon McDevitt, in the year of our Lord 2026, are not so carnal that you just couldn't bring yourself to go to church if it was a cappella. Surely not. You would go.
No, that's ridiculous.
Right? And so I'm saying, everyone, if you're having this discussion, this doesn't apply to you. Okay, if you're having this discussion, you're spiritual enough to go to an a cappella. Like the only people who are really affected by this argument are like the most worldly people.
I see what you're saying.
That we don't talk to, right? This argument doesn't apply to Will. Like Will shouldn't want musical instruments because I'm sure Will could stand to go to church if they weren't there. And this argument doesn't apply to Brandon because I'm sure he could stand to go to church if they weren't there. But you were talking people who couldn't.
It's so banger though.
That's so moving on to Thomas's argument. They're bangers, right? That's another problem, right?
Dude, they're tough.
They're tough, right? They incite carnal passions. Now this is just the problem. Here's the thing. They do. Here's the thing about musical instruments, right? Musical instrument and music in general actually kind of does this. Is that music causes you to dance? This is one of the things that humans across everywhere do, right? Now, I'm not saying dancing is sinful. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Okay. But what I am saying is that music is bodily because it incites a sensuous bodily reaction for everyone. Everyone dances to music. This is just universal. Now, anyway, so that's not a cultural thing. And in fact, we even see the dancing in the Old Testament, right? That it's associated with the musical instruments. And the dancing doesn't get introduced until the music gets introduced chronologically in 2 Chronicles, right? And so in the New Testament, because the worship is less bodily, it's less instrumental. Now, it is true that melodies themselves do this. And one could imagine a purely intellectual worship, which doesn't involve the sensations at all. But that's too sublime for man. That's for angels. And so we have a worship that's as sublime as our form agrees to. Which still involves music, but it doesn't involve the instruments. Now, concerning melodies, and I wanted to get to this, there actually has been some interesting discussion, both in the ancient church and in the Presbyterian church, historically, and even now, I've had some discussions about it. So there is a thing in Presbyterianism, historically, and in my church, but it depends on what kind of Presbyterian you are. You sing really, really slow. I'm talking like you wouldn't be like, in Judah's land, God is well known. You'd be like, in Judah's land, God is well known.
Yeah.
So the reason that practice was preferred in Presbyterianism historically, and still in some like in mine, right, is for these reasons, right? Singing quickly it tends to be like vacuous. Like it causes like carnal passions. And for the same reason, certain melodies. So like there's actually so I'm not part of the RPCNA, I'm part of the Free Church Continuing. The RPCNA uses a different psalter than we do, and people in my church will often complain about the RPCNA psalter on the grounds that the melodies in it are too too elaborate, and they like incite carnal passion, like literally. Right. Whereas the melodies that we use are like, so when I first started going to my church, my Free Church, it was really I was super confused. Because not that I was confused, but I was very I was having a hard time singing because the melodies that we use, you've probably never heard any of them except for maybe 1 or 2, and they're not the ones I used to sing. They're very different melodies, and they are so foreign, and they are so unintuitive, and they are so just like if you're going to think about singing the Psalms, you're gonna have to think about the words. Now there is the other side of that, which is the melody's too confusing. It actually gets harder to sing, and then you can't think about the words. But there are benefits. Now in the ancient church, and Augustine actually talks about this. He has a very interesting discussion about this. In Augustine's churches, the ones that he presided over, they sang monotone. They didn't sing multiple notes. So they would sing like in Judah's land, God is well known, his name in Israel great, right? They wouldn't sing various notes. And it was spooky. It was for the obvious reasons. And he actually went to a church where he found that they were singing like multiple notes, right? And they were just singing one note. And he talks about it. He says, I really liked this service, but they were singing multiple notes, and that worried me a little bit. Although he admits that it was actually apparently really good. But it did worry him. So anyway, that is the rationale. So anyway, I don't think it's
very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. That is helpful historical perspective. So a lot of this seems to be tied in the Reform view, Jeremiah, to like the carnality of the Old Covenant.
Oh yeah.
Like, I don't see a lot of those arguments being made by the fathers, of like the carnality of the covenant itself. Is this more of like a Reformed?
No, it's patristic. So the argument about allegorization just is the carnality argument. Like they look like different arguments, but they aren't, right? The argument about allegorization is that you have for example, in Psalm 118, it says, and this is why the Psalm arguments for instruments just aren't good, is that in Psalm 118, it says, like it commands the singer to take a ram and to tie up its horns on the altar and to kill it. Obviously don't do this. But read any patristic on this, they will allegorize that passage 100% of the time. And they'll say, what this actually means for you, right, is this means that Christ has been like tied on the cross and has been like driven through the right? Now, that's not what it meant originally, obviously. And so when they allegorize it, they're not saying, they're not denying the history. They're saying this is what it means for you. They're not saying this is what it meant for them, right? They're saying this is what it prototyped. So these are actually the same argument. But yeah, the carnality argument is legit. Obviously, you have the argument from Augustine about like even seeing multiple notes, right? So you can see how far they were going into it. Clearly,
the reason I just don't buy that though is because the animal sacrifice thing does have such a clear typological fulfillment.
No, but so does the instruments.
it's really just not the same. Like,
So does the incense, by the way. So like
oh,
yeah, we don't use
yeah,
incense.
okay. Like, so you're saying you'd be against the use of incense as well?
Yeah.
Do you see how like the animal sacrifice does have like a very obvious typological fulfillment?
It's the most well-known typological fulfillment because it's the most important one. But in substance, the typological fulfillments are the same type of thing. It's just that the animal sacrifice one is the most well-known and it's the most necessary to be understood.
Well, it's also like explicitly
Maybe
taught
visual.
in scripture. I mean, it's not just like an inference.
Yeah,
thing.
it's the most
like,
obvious. Yeah.
Like like the New Testament in particular is full of references of how.
Right. It talks
Yeah.
about it more. It's like with the instrument fulfillments, we only have like a couple places where this is talked about. And with the incense fulfillment, we only have a couple places where it's talked about, like in Revelation. But with the animal sacrifice fulfillment, this is of such importance to understand that it's explained everywhere. But it's
Right.
not a substantially different thing. It's just a more important thing. It's a more, so like, I would argue that like it's superstitious to use animal sacrifices just like it is to use instruments. But to use animal sacrifices is far more superstitious because one, the typological fulfillment is of greater value. And second of all, it's more clearly prophesied in scripture that you'd have to be in greater rebellion.
Now you mentioned there was one place in the New Testament where you believed that typological fulfillment of musical instruments was alluded to.
Two.
Where was that? Or
Ephesians
two?
5:19 and Colossians 3:16. But they're identical, so it's like the same thing.
What does it say?
It's the one that says to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, making melody in your heart.
Mm.
Here, I'll go to the thing.
So I mean, that's just him speaking metaphorically, though. Like that's not really.
That's not how
referring to
anyone.
any-
That's not how anyone took that historically.
how-
Everyone took it. Like if you read any patristic commentary on the on this passage, and they are agreed on the meaning. When he says "sing in the heart," right? Because the melody is to harp, like literally to harp the melodies in your heart. They say that this is the typological fulfillment of musical instruments. This
of
is
all
agreed.
musical instruments.
Yeah, like of worship and musical. Because he's talking about worshiping God, right? He's saying we used to worship God with music instruments. Now we don't. Now we do the thing in the heart, and that's like it seems weird. Like when you read the patristic, they talk about all this allegorization of instruments. Like where in the world are you getting this idea? Like what in the world are you talking about? This is where they get this. This is where they get this, right?
Do you have any of the patristic sources on that readily available?
I have them lying around somewhere.
Because I really for this presentation tried to scour the fathers for like any
I don't
direct
have them on
reference.
hand, but I can give them to you. I do have them, but I don't have like a dog.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway.
If you wouldn't mind sharing that at some point, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I will.
Because I mean, that's the biggest thing for me. Like, sacrifices are so obviously typologically fulfilled.
Yeah.
I don't see that as the case with musical instruments, and like I especially don't see like the one or two references in the New Testament of like making a melody with your heart.
Oh, and they would also cite 1 Corinthians 14 about the lifeless instruments.
I read that passage fully, and
It's not talking about worship there. It is.
I'm struggling.
They refused. They used it anyway.
They refused what?
They used it anyway because the passage isn't about worship. He's talking about love, and he's saying that like if you don't have love, you're like a clanging cymbal or like a playing bugle.
Right. That's just like that's a metaphor. That's like
Right. But they clung on to the word lifeless being used to describe the instruments, and they said that's the polemic. It's idle, so we don't do it. This is just what they said.
I feel that's I don't know. I feel that's a stretch in of itself because like I don't think anyone who uses music or instruments in worship is gonna say that they're not lifeless.
Right.
objects.
No.
Like, they're objects.
Regardless whether you say they're lifeless or not, but that is they just are lifeless, and we shouldn't be praising God with anything lifeless. It's just his idea, right? Unless he tells us to. So.
I mean, the other part of that equation is that some instruments do use the breath of life.
No. Not that they use the breath of life. Like he's saying they need to be alive. They aren't alive themselves. That was what they were saying. So the reason the organ argument doesn't work because organs aren't alive. They're not.
It's true.
They're not alive, right? This is true.
Organs aren't alive.
The thing producing the music needs to be alive, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's what they were saying. The thing producing the music must be like a lively, like rational creature.
I gotcha.
Because now we have the spiritual worship, and like an organ can do that.
I do think, just as some concluding remarks, because we should wrap up here probably. My take on this is, like I said, I think a lot of the Church Fathers' concerns about instruments were reasonable, and I think that they're especially reasonable given the fact that just about every musical instrument in existence at the time had specific pagan ties and most of the instruments in the time of the New Testament were not conducive to worship, generally speaking. And so I think generally all of their like theological statements and their prohibitions are reasonable. At the same time, I do think that they perhaps let their cultural bias against instruments in general flavor the way they interpret scripture in ways that are probably not reasonable. Like honestly, when I read, was it Chrysos? No, it was Clement of Alexandria.
Cyprian's quote on like not like even looking at musical instruments.
Yeah,
like, that goes. He's so real for that. He's so incredibly real for that.
You can just hear the animosity that there was
yeah.
toward instruments in general, and I have a hard time believing that bias against instruments wouldn't affect the way they interpret the biblical text.
So, like, what's the positive argument in favor? Like, why should positively we have instruments? What's the argument?
Well, I mean, you do have like an Old Testament precedent, and I know you say that there's typological fulfillment there. I don't.
No,
think
I'm asking you what they do. Like, what does an instrument like benefit in Christian worship?
Well, in our setting, like it 100% aids in congregational singing. Like I'm just going to talk about my context in particular. We're at a very small parish. You know, we have 30 to 40 people on a Sunday. Many of us are not strong singers. And a lot of the service we do a cappella, like the Psalms, a lot of the other elements of the liturgy, we don't have an accompaniment for. And honestly, the congregation can like struggle with that a bit. Like there's like pitch issues. And then as soon as we get the accompaniment for the hymn, it is so much better. We know what pitch we're supposed to start on. We're all in unison.
You get a percent.
You asked what it does for us. That's what it does for us. It really does.
Like, that's not necessary. You can just use a percentage just like that.
Use a what?
You just get someone 2%, which is hard. I get percent, like it's not hard to do. And then you're just set.
Yeah, I mean that's
like we do this, and it's like my congregation is similar to yours, I suppose, because we have like probably 35 people in my congregation, and we obviously don't have instruments, and everyone in my congregation is a convert, everyone except for like one guy. And so none of us know how to sing. None of us know how to sing, right? And we just do it anyway, and it's not a problem. And it's like it's one of those things where it's like it's a psychological, like you think you're not going to be able to do it because you don't believe, like, but then when you just start doing it, because we believe we have to do it, right? So we just start doing it, and it just works, and you like realize, oh, this was a ridiculous fear. This is obviously just totally manageable. And the history just testifies to this, that like Christians just did sing a cappella for 1,000 years and just didn't have any issues.
Yeah, but like I said, we do it. But that's not the only reason we do it. Like that's not the only benefit it gives us. There's that practical element, but there's also just like a beauty element as well. And this is something like Brandon, you visited a Lutheran church, I know, last Sunday. And there is something about the instruments aiding the passions in an appropriate way. Like our passion, and this might be like a philosophical disagreement that you and I have, Jeremiah. But like if you buy into like the whole Aristotelian system, our passions are actually a good God-ordained gift. It's not like we're trying to be totally passionless in worship. And if we are, that's actually like disordered. Like our passions ought to be aroused in the correct way toward like worship of God, right? And so when you have a hymn that evokes a certain emotion, as long as that emotion is appropriate to what you're singing and the end of the hymn itself, whether it be like a catechetical hymn or just like a praise hymn, if it moves your passions in the correct way, that's a good use of the instrument.
So, this is actually a good point. So I was talking to my elders about this, one of them, and I was saying like, hey, can you, because he basically publishes the bulletin the day before. I was like, can you publish it earlier? And he was telling me about the stuff that he does with the bulletin for years. So apparently the minister who visits us, he picks the Psalms, and then he picks not the minister, but the elder picks the melody. And he says, I said like, hey, can you tell me what melodies we're going to sing like a week before? He says, no, I can't do that. I was like, why not? Like, you just pick 3 melodies. Because I don't know, but the melodies that we use are all interchangeable. So like they're all in the same meter. So you could just pick any song, just put any melody on it, right?
Right. That's how our Psalms
are. Yeah. So can you just like put it a week before you know what Psalms are? He's like, no, because I need to find them when I need to know what the Psalm is so that I don't put like an upbeat melody or like some really gladsome melody on like Psalm 51 or something, right?
Exactly.
And I was like, okay, I mean, I guess it's fair enough, right? I'm actually not sure how I feel about that, but so yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's the same principle at work, right? You want the emotive element of the melody to be appropriately tied to the psalm that you're singing, right?
I suppose my only objection at that point, and this is like a mood argument because we don't agree on this, but I would say the only argument I have at this point would be that the melodies are commanded, but yeah.
So anyway, that's why we do it. That's why Lutherans do it. I imagine that's why most Christians do it. It does aid in getting you to feel the appropriate things when you're singing these hymns. I do think that's a good thing. We're not meant to be just totally passionless in worship. Aren't we meant to feel an affection toward God in our worship? And if musical instruments can aid in that, that's a good thing, I think.
I agree.
Jeremiah, I thank you for coming on, sharing the Reformed perspective. Our listeners are undoubtedly going to benefit from that and enjoy hearing that perspective. Brandon, I thank you in particular for coming on tonight and co-hosting with me in Pastor King's absence. We will get this out on the podcast.
Dude, when you said that B was going to come on, I thought you meant at the end.
It was.
So then he came on, and I was like, wait, what? I thought it was going to be Pastor King. So we got Mr. B as a hostile takeover.
When I first asked Brandon on Discord, it was meant to be at the end. But then I got thinking, I was like, man, I just don't want to like monologue for 30 minutes.
You got to have a presenter, I suppose.
Yeah, it's good to make this a dialogue.
Hopefully,
All right, do y'all mind if I pray to close this out?
Yeah, let's do it.
As I normally do. Almighty and everlasting God, you sent your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, to take upon himself our flesh and to suffer death upon the cross. Mercifully grant that we may follow the example of his great humility and patience and be made partakers of his resurrection. Through the same Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining us tonight. Everyone who's watching live, I'll edit this podcast and we'll get it out tomorrow. Thank you guys for coming on tonight.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully I was able to bless the listeners' ears.
What a blessing.
All right. Just for
all
that.
right. Thank you, B. Thank you,